To the ravenous tabloids of the late 90s, she was the ultimate taboo, the secret girlfriend of Prince Harry, and the niece of the woman blamed for destroying Diana's marriage. To the tabloids, Emma Parker Bowles was the ultimate taboo, a forbidden romance that threatened to tear the royal family apart all over again. But this is not a love story. It is a tragedy of collateral damage. Emma was the practice run for the royal wild child, a young woman who was demonized by the press simply for carrying the hated surname Parker Bowles. While her Aunt Camilla slowly climbed her way to the throne, Emma was left to drown in a toxic cocktail of addiction, exile, and public shame. This is the untold story of the girl who was crushed between the ghosts of Diana and the ambition of Camilla. The British upper class in the 1970s was a hermetically sealed ecosystem. It was a world where everyone knew everyone, went to the same schools, married the same cousins, and attended the same hunt balls. In this suffocating fishbowl, the affair between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles wasn't a scandal. It was an open secret. It was simply part of the landscape, as inevitable as the English rain or the Queen's corgis. Emma grew up in the shadow of this secret. To the rest of the world, Charles was the dashing bachelor prince searching for a fairy tale bride. To the Parker Bowles family, he was just a man who was always around. He was a presence in the drawing rooms, a voice on the telephone, a godfather to the children. For a young Emma, Aunt Camilla was not a villain. She was just the warm, funny, earthy woman who smoked cigarettes in the garden and laughed with a throaty chuckle that could be heard 3 rooms away. Camilla was the fun aunt. She wasn't the Rottweiler that Princess Diana would later describe. She was a woman of immense charm and emotional intelligence, traits that made her indispensable to the Prince of Wales, but dangerous to everyone else. Emma's childhood should have been idyllic. She was raised in the lush green corridors of the English countryside, surrounded by ponies and privilege. But beneath the tweed surface, there was a current of instability. Her father, Richard, was a man of considerable charm, but fragile constitution. The Parker Bowles men were known for their charisma, but also for their appetites. Alcohol flowed through the family tree like sap. Richard struggled with the bottle, a demon that would eventually come for his daughter, too. In this environment, emotions were not discussed. They were repressed. If you were sad, you went for a walk. If you were angry, you played squash. If you were desperate, you poured a gin and tonic. Emma learned early on that appearance was everything. You kept your chin up. You smiled for the cameras. You never, ever let the side down. But the side was letting itself down. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the tension in the Parker Bowles orbit began to tighten. The pressure on Prince Charles to marry was reaching a fever pitch. He needed a virgin. He needed an aristocrat. He needed a broodmare for the dynasty. He found Lady Diana Spencer. The royal wedding of 1981 was the moment the trap snapped shut. Emma was 7 years old. To the global public, it was a fairy tale come to life. The glass coach, the shy bride, the dashing prince. But inside the church, the air was thick with a different kind of electricity. Camilla was there, sitting in the pews, wearing a gray suit and a pillbox hat. Diana, walking down the aisle, famously looked for her. She knew. The Parker Bowles family knew. Emma, young and impressionable, was watching a play where everyone was reciting their lines while holding a dagger behind their back. She was learning a dangerous lesson, that truth doesn't matter, only the performance matters. As the 80s progressed, the fairy tale began to rot. The War of the Waleses broke out. The tabloids turned their predatory gaze toward the third person in the marriage. Suddenly, the name Parker Bowles was no longer just an aristocratic signifier. It was a curse. It became shorthand for adultery, shorthand for betrayal, shorthand for the destruction of the people's princess. Imagine being a teenager at a posh boarding school during this era. Boarding school is a brutal environment at the best of times, a place of hierarchy and casual cruelty. But for Emma, it was a gauntlet. Every time a newspaper ran a story about Camilla, Emma felt the eyes on her. Is that true about your aunt? Why does she hate Diana? My mom says your family is evil. Children absorb the anxieties of their elders. Emma watched as her aunt was hunted. She saw the paparazzi camped at the end of the driveway, their long lenses looking like sniper rifles. She saw the hate mail. She saw bread rolls thrown at Camilla in the supermarket. And she felt a confusing cognitive dissonance. The world was telling her that her family was the villain. The world loved Diana, beautiful, saintly, radiant Diana. Therefore, if you were a Parker Bowles, you were the anti-Diana. You were the darkness to her light. But Emma loved her family. She knew them as human beings, flawed but loving. This conflict between the public narrative and her private reality began to fracture her sense of self. She felt protective of her aunt, yet ashamed of the scandal. She felt like an outsider in her own country. Compounding this was the internal dynamic of her own nuclear family. Her parents' marriage was straining. Her father's drinking was becoming more pronounced. Emma was a sensitive child, an empath who soaked up the unspoken misery around her like a sponge. She didn't have the hardened shell of her Uncle Andrew, who could brush off the scandal with a shrug. She felt it all. By the time she reached her late teens, the pressure cooker was whistling. It was the early 1990s. The Camillagate tapes had leaked, revealing the intimate, embarrassing phone calls between Charles and Camilla. The humiliation was total. The Parker Bowles name was dragged through the mud of the global press. Emma was entering adulthood with a target on her back. She was beautiful, blonde, and privileged, the perfect ingredients for an it girl. But she was also damaged. She was looking for an escape, a way to numb the feeling of being the bad seed. She found her escape in London. The city was swinging again, and for a girl who wanted to forget her last name, the nightclubs of Chelsea offered a glittering, deafening oblivion. She moved to the city ostensibly to work. She got a job at Tatler, the Bible of high society. It was a job she got because of her name, not despite it. The magazine knew that having a Parker Bowles on the masthead was edgy. It was controversial. Emma was used as a prop, a connection to the royal drama that everyone was obsessed with. She played the part. She posed for photos. She attended the gallery openings. She dated the eligible bachelors. She became a Sloane Ranger, that specific tribe of wealthy, well-connected Londoners who lived in a bubble of champagne and gossip. But beneath the lip gloss and the designer dresses, Emma was terrified. She was suffering from what she would later identify as toxic shame. She grew up believing the family sins lived in her blood, a toxic inheritance she tried for years to drown. And so she began to self-medicate. It started innocently enough. A glass of wine to take the edge off before a party, a line of cocaine in the bathroom to keep the conversation going. In the high-octane world of 90s London, this wasn't unusual behavior. It was the baseline. Everyone was doing it. But for Emma, substances weren't just a social lubricant. They were a survival mechanism. They allowed her to be the fun Emma, the wild Emma, the girl who didn't care about the headlines. When she was high, she wasn't the niece of the most hated woman in Britain. She was just a girl dancing on a table. As the mid-90s approached, the royal drama reached its tragic crescendo. Charles and Diana divorced. The monarchy was in crisis. And then Paris, the tunnel, the crash. When Diana died in 1997, The grief that swept the world was weaponized. The anger needed a target. It couldn't target the queen, and it couldn't target the young princes, so it targeted Charles and Camilla. The hatred reached a level of hysteria that is hard to comprehend today. Emma was in the middle of this storm. She saw the vitriol directed at her aunt. She heard the public calling for Camilla's head. And in that moment of national trauma, Emma Parker Bowles stood on a precipice. She was about to make a series of choices that would take her from the society pages to the tabloids and lead her into the arms of the one person she was absolutely forbidden to touch. The stage was set for the next generation of the scandal. The aunt had broken the father. Now the niece was about to collide with the son. But trauma does not stay buried in the countryside. It follows you to the city. As Emma fled the suffocating whispers of the shires for the bright lights of London, she wasn't just looking for a job. She was looking for a mask. The 1990s were swinging into high gear, a decade of hedonism and excess that provided the perfect camouflage for a girl trying to disappear in plain sight. She would trade the tweed for designer silk and the ponies for Porsches, attempting to reinvent herself as the queen of the social scene. But she would soon discover that in the relentless glare of the paparazzi flashbulb, there is nowhere to hide. London in the mid-1990s was the heart of cool Britannia, a city vibrating on amphetamines, where Kate Moss ruled and aristocrats pretended to be rock stars. For a young, beautiful, well-connected girl like Emma Parker Bowles, the city wasn't just a playground. It was a stage. She landed a job at Tatler, the high-gloss Bible of British society. On paper, she was the motoring correspondent. It was a job title that bordered on the absurd. Emma wasn't a mechanic. She was a muse. Her role was to look fabulous leaning against an Aston Martin, to attend the launch parties of new Jaguars, and to embody the carefree, moneyed spirit of the age. To the outside observer, she had it all. She was a Sloane Ranger par excellence, a member of that tribe of wealthy, upper-class girls who populated the boutiques of Chelsea and the nightclubs of Mayfair. She had blonde hair, the cut-glass accent, and VIP access to every club in town. She ran with the it crowd, partying with Tara Palmer Tompkinson and Lady Victoria Hervey. But if you looked closely at the photos from that era, the grainy paparazzi shots taken outside China White or Annabelle's at 3 a.m., you could see the cracks in the porcelain. There was a frantic, glassy quality to her eyes. Her smile was often a little too wide, a little too fixed. Emma was performing. She was playing the role of the wild child because it was the only role the media would allow her to play. If she couldn't be the saintly victim like Diana, she would lean into the decadence of the Parker Bowles brand. Behind the velvet ropes, however, Emma was disintegrating. The pressure of her last name was constant, low-level radiation. Every time she introduced herself at a party, there was a beat of silence. Parker Bowles? Related to her? She had to develop a thick skin, a deflective humor to survive the judgment. She learned to laugh it off, to make the joke before anyone else could. But laughter wasn't enough to drown out the noise. So she turned to chemistry. The 90s were awash in cocaine and champagne, the twin fuels of the London social scene. For Emma, they became medicine. Alcohol softened the edges of her anxiety. Cocaine gave her the artificial confidence to walk into a room where half the people hated her family. It was a dangerous cocktail. What started as social partying quickly metastasized into dependency. She wasn't just having fun, she was obliterating herself. She was drinking to blackout. She was taking risks. She was trying to numb the toxic shame that she had carried since childhood, the feeling that she was inherently dirty, a byproduct of the sin that had broken the royal fairy tale. And then, in 1997, the world stopped. The death of Princess Diana in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris was a seismic event that reshaped the emotional landscape of Britain. For the Parker Bowles family, it was a catastrophe. In the days and weeks following the crash, the public grief for Diana mutated into a terrifying rage against Charles and Camilla. The narrative was simple and biblical. Diana was the martyr, Charles was the sinner, and Camilla was the devil. Emma was in London during this hysteria. She saw the sea of flowers at Kensington Palace. She heard the weeping in the streets, but she also felt the vitriol. The Parker Bowles family went into lockdown. Camilla was effectively under house arrest at her home in the country, unable to leave for fear of being lynched by the press. Emma, however, was out in the open. She was the visible Parker Bowles. The tabloids, starved for a villain they could actually photograph, turned their lenses on the niece. They scrutinized her partying. They analyzed her appearance. They looked for signs of the family rot. Every time Emma stumbled out of a club, it wasn't just a drunk girl. It was proof of the moral decay of the Parker Bowles clan, like aunt, like niece. This period was the darkest of her life. She was grieving too. Diana had been a presence in her life, a figure she knew and respected, but she wasn't allowed to grieve publicly. How could she? She was the enemy. The cognitive dissonance broke her. Her addiction spiraled out of control. The parties became darker, longer, and more desperate. She was no longer just the it girl. She was becoming a tragic figure, a cautionary tale whispered about in the drawing rooms of her parents' friends. Poor Richard, they would say. Have you seen Emma? She's completely off the rails. It was in this state of extreme vulnerability, damaged, addicted, and isolated by her infamy, that she found herself drifting into the orbit of another lost soul. In the late 90s, Harry was not the polished Duke of Sussex we know today. He was the spare. He was a teenage boy whose mother had died violently and publicly. He was angry. He was grieving. And crucially, he was rebelling against the very institution that Emma's family was trying to marry into. Harry was acting out. He was caught smoking cannabis. He was drinking underage. He was fighting with photographers. He was screaming for attention or perhaps screaming for help. The media loved to paint Harry as the party prince. But Emma saw something else. She saw a mirror. They moved in the same rarefied circles, the polo matches, the country house weekends, the private VIP rooms of London clubs. It was inevitable that their paths would cross. But when they did, it wasn't just a meeting of two aristocrats. It was a collision of two traumas. Harry was the son of the victim. Emma was the niece of the villain. By the laws of the tabloid narrative, they should have been enemies. They should have hated each other. But trauma is a strange matchmaker. In the incestuous, lonely goldfish bowl of royal life, they were the only two people who spoke the same language. They both knew what it felt like to be defined by a tragedy they didn't create. They both knew what it felt like to be hunted by the press, and they both knew the numbing comfort of a vodka tonic at 2 a.m., whether it was a romance or merely a friendship between two lost souls. The optics were magnetic and forbidden. Emma was significantly older, but in the incestuous circles of the aristocracy, lines are often blurred. As the millennium approached, whispers began to circulate in London's VIP rooms. Were they just friends? Or was something more happening? To the outside world, the truth didn't matter as much as the headline. It was Shakespearean. The Capulets and the Montagues. Even the rumor of a romance was a PR nuclear bomb. Prince Charles was spending every ounce of his political capital trying to rehabilitate Camilla's image, trying to make the public accept her as his future wife. The idea that his son, Diana's son, was sleeping with Camilla's niece was a narrative twist that the palace spin doctors couldn't handle. For Emma, it wasn't about politics. It was about connection. For a brief moment in the arms of the one person she wasn't supposed to touch, she felt seen. But she had no idea that this moment of comfort was about to light a fuse that would blow her life apart. The tabloids were sniffing around, the courtiers were watching, and the Windsor wild child was about to become the center of a scandal that would make her previous partying look like a church picnic. Secrets in the royal family are like radiation. You can't see them, but they eventually poison everything they touch. As the millennium turned, the whispered rumors about Emma and the young Prince Harry began to coalesce into a concrete narrative, moving from the hushed corners of VIP rooms to the editorial desks of Fleet Street. The invisible tripwire had been triggered. Emma Parker Bowles, who had spent her life trying to escape the stigma of her family name, was about to find herself at the center of a scandal that was almost Shakespearean in its irony. The niece of the woman who broke the marriage was now sleeping with the son who had suffered the most. To understand the sheer, explosive magnitude of the scandal that erupted in 1999, one must appreciate the precarious state of the British monarchy at that specific moment in time. Prince Charles was engaged in the most delicate PR campaign in history, Operation RB. His team of spin doctors was working around the clock to slowly, carefully reintroduce Camilla Parker Bowles to the British public, not as the Rottweiler, but as a suitable consort for the future king. The strategy relied on stability. It relied on keeping the drama to a minimum. And then, like a grenade tossed into a greenhouse, came the news that Prince Harry was intimately involved with Camilla's niece. The relationship between Emma Parker Bowles and Prince Harry remains one of the most fascinating yet least analyzed chapters of the Windsor saga. On the surface, it was a mismatch. Emma was 25, a worldly, hardened socialite who had already lived a lifetime in the London fast lane. Harry was 15 or 16, a grieving, angry boy who was still grappling with the death of his mother just 2 years prior. But look closer, and the logic of their connection becomes heartbreakingly clear. They were both damaged goods in the eyes of the establishment. Harry was the spare, the boy who was allowed to be wild because he didn't carry the burden of the crown. Emma was the black sheep, the girl who carried the burden of her aunt's sin. They met in the incestuous, closed-loop world of the aristocracy, at polo matches in Cirencester, at private house parties in Gloucestershire, where everyone is related by blood or by scandal. For Harry, Emma must have been a revelation. She wasn't one of the terrified debutantes who curtsied and stuttered in his presence. She was older, she was cool, she drove fast cars, she knew the best clubs, and most importantly, she wasn't afraid of his family. She was his family, in a twisted de facto way. She offered him a window into the other side, the Parker Bowles side, that wasn't filtered through the hatred of the press. In her presence, the War of the Waleses ceased to be a global conflict and became just a messed up family dynamic that they could both roll their eyes at. For Emma, the attraction was likely more complex. Harry was the ultimate taboo. To be with him was the ultimate act of rebellion against the narrative that said she should be ashamed of her name. But perhaps, on a deeper level, she simply saw a boy who was hurting as much as she was. They were two lonely people in a crowded room, bonding over the shared absurdity of their existence. However, the tabloids did not see nuance. They saw a headline. When the story broke, it didn't just leak, it detonated. The Sun, the News of the World, and the Daily Mail cleared their front pages. The angles were vicious and contradictory. On one hand, Emma was painted as the cradle snatcher, the predatory older woman leading the innocent young prince astray. On the other hand, she was portrayed as the Trojan horse, a sleeper agent of the Parker Bowles clan sent to sink her claws into Diana's son to solidify their grip on power. The headlines were brutal: Harry and the wild niece. Camilla's girl leads prince astray. The Parker Bowles plot. They dug up every photo of Emma looking disheveled at a nightclub. They ran lists of her previous boyfriends. They analyzed her cleavage, her drinking habits, her Sloane Ranger lifestyle. They juxtaposed photos of her partying with photos of Harry looking young and vulnerable, creating a visual narrative of corruption. Inside St. James's Palace, the reaction was thermonuclear. Sources from the Times suggest that Prince Charles was apoplectic. This wasn't just a teenage fling, it was a political disaster. Charles was trying to prove to the public and to his mother, the Queen, that Camilla was a stabilizing influence. The narrative he was selling was that the Parker Bowles family was respectable, quiet, and dignified. Emma's behavior and her entanglement with Harry shattered that narrative. It reminded the public of the Camilla chaos. It reminded everyone that the Parker Bowles family brought drama. Worse, it threatened to alienate William and Harry from Camilla, just as they were starting to accept her. If Harry was seen to be corrupted by Camilla's niece, the public would turn on Camilla all over again. The specter of Diana loomed large. The press began to ask, what would Diana think of her son dating that woman's niece? The machinery of the palace swung into action. This is where the ruthlessness of the firm becomes apparent. When a royal romance is inconvenient, it is suffocated. The relationship, whatever it truly was crushed. We will likely never know the exact conversations that took place behind the closed doors of Highgrove. Was Harry sworn to silence? Was Emma threatened with social exile? What we do know is that the extraction was surgical. Harry was sent back to his studies, protected by the palace PR machine, which spun the story as a young boy's folly. Emma, however, was left exposed on the battlefield. There is a specific kind of misogyny reserved for women who get too close to the crown. They are either saints or witches. Emma was firmly cast as the witch. The press turned her into a caricature. She was the bad influence. She was the party girl. She was the physical embodiment of the Parker Bowles taint. She had no protection officers. She had no press secretary. She was alone in London, with the paparazzi camped on her doorstep, shouting questions about whether she had slept with the prince. The psychological impact on Emma was devastating. She had thought, perhaps naively, that her connection to Harry validated her. She thought it proved she wasn't just the niece of the mistress, but a person worthy of the prince's attention. Instead, the scandal reinforced her deepest insecurity, that she was toxic, that she was something to be used and then discarded to protect the real royals. The end of the affair and the subsequent public humiliation accelerated her downward spiral. If she was going to be painted as the wild child, she decided she might as well play the part to the hilt. The drinking moved from heavy social to medical necessity. The cocaine use escalated. Emma began to inhabit the darker corners of the London night. She stopped caring about the launch parties and the Tatler columns. She started disappearing for days at a time. Her friends, the fair-weather friends of the social scene, began to distance themselves. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a royal scandal. Invitations dried up. The phone stopped ringing, unless it was a journalist offering money for a kiss and tell. To her credit, and this is a crucial point in her character arc, Emma never sold Harry out. She could have made a fortune. She could have given an interview to the news of the world, detailing every secret rendezvous, every conversation about Diana. every complaint about Charles. It would have secured her financial future, but she didn't. She kept the code. She maintained the silence of the aristocracy, even as that aristocracy was freezing her out. However, silence eats you alive. Without an outlet for her pain, she internalized it. She began to exhibit the classic signs of a person trying to destroy themselves before the world does it for them. There were reports of erratic behavior, of scenes caused in public, of a brightness in her eyes that looked less like joy and more like panic. The Harry factor had proven to be the tipping point. Before the scandal, she was a girl on the edge. After the scandal, she was in free fall. London, the city she had loved, had turned into a prison of mirrors, where every headline and every whisper reflected back a distorted, monstrous version of herself. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she couldn't stay. If she stayed in England, she would die. She would become another obituary in the Times. A tragic footnote. Niece of Camilla found dead. She needed to go somewhere where the name Parker Bowles didn't immediately conjure images of adultery and monarchy. She needed a place where reinvention was the local religion. She looked west, toward the sun, toward the plastic, forgetful paradise of Los Angeles. She told her family she was going to pursue a career in television. She told her friends she needed a break, but deep down, Emma knew the truth. She wasn't chasing a dream. She was fleeing a nightmare. She was running from the ghost of Diana, the judgment of the public, and the suffocating label of being a bad influence on the young prince. She wasn't just fleeing a boy, she was fleeing a caricature of herself that the British press had created. But as she boarded the plane to California, leaving the gray skies of London behind, she made a fatal miscalculation. She thought she could leave her addiction at Heathrow Terminal 4. She didn't realize that in Los Angeles, demons don't just survive, they thrive. There is a specific mythology about Los Angeles that seduces the broken. The idea that you can change your geography, and in doing so, change your soul. Emma Parker Bowles boarded that plane, believing she was flying toward a cure. She thought that if she could just get far enough away from the tabloids, from the gray skies of London, and from the heavy, suffocating weight of her surname, she could finally breathe. She was chasing the great American fiction of the second act. But she forgot the oldest rule of travel. You pack your demons in your carry-on. The flight to California didn't save her. It merely transported her addiction from a damp, cynical island to a bright, sun-drenched desert where the shadows are sharper and the falls are much, much harder. When Emma landed at LAX in the early 2000s, the sun was shining. To a girl raised in the damp drawing rooms of Gloucestershire and the foggy streets of London, the light of California must have felt like a baptism. Los Angeles sells itself on this light. It promises reinvention. It whispers that history doesn't matter, only the future matters. For a woman whose history was printed on the front page of The Sun, this was an intoxicating promise. Emma arrived with a plan, or at least the glossy outline of one. She was going to be a TV presenter. She was going to be an actress. She was going to monetize the one asset she had left, her Britishness. In the early 2000s, Hollywood had a fetish for the posh Brit. Emma, with her cut-glass accent, her aristocratic bone structure, and her connection to the royal family, was a commodity. She hit the ground running. She even posed for Maxim in a bikini, a move that would have given her grandmother a heart attack, but played well in Malibu. She auditioned for reality shows. She modeled. She tried to craft a persona that was posh but naughty, a sort of aristocratic Paris Hilton. But beneath the tan and the bleached blonde hair, the rot was spreading. Los Angeles is a dangerous city for an addict because it enables you to be dysfunctional while looking healthy. You can drink vodka for breakfast, do cocaine for lunch, and still go to a yoga class at sunset. The wellness culture masks the decay. Emma fell into this trap perfectly. In London, her drinking had been social, fueled by the pub culture and the dinner parties. In Los Angeles, her addiction became solitary and pharmaceutical. She discovered the American medicine cabinet. The doctors in Beverly Hills were generous with their prescription pads. Anxiety? Take a Xanax, can't sleep. Take an Ambien, need energy, take an Adderall. Emma began to construct a chemical barrier between herself and reality. She needed to numb the homesickness, yes, but more importantly, she needed to numb the profound sense of failure. She had fled England to become a star, but she was becoming a cliché. The Eurotrash girl at the party who stays too long and talks too loud. Her apartment in the Hollywood Hills became a fortress of isolation. She would go days without speaking to anyone, existing on a diet of pills and white wine. When she did go out, it was to the Viper Room or the Chateau Marmont, places where the lighting was low and the questions were few. It was during these lost years in California that the contrast between her life and her aunt's life became most stark. Back in England, the Operation RB campaign was reaching its triumphant conclusion. The British public, worn down by years of PR spin and the simple passage of time, had begun to accept Camilla. She was no longer the Rottweiler. She was the Duchess of Cornwall in waiting. She was cutting ribbons. She was shaking hands. She was being photographed smiling next to the Queen. The irony was brutal. The woman who had caused the scandal, the villain, was ascending to the throne. The girl, who had merely been caught in the crossfire, the victim, was descending into the gutter. The year 2005 marked the nadir. This was the year Prince Charles finally married Camilla Parker Bowles. It was the culmination of a 30-year war. The wedding at the Windsor Guildhall was a subdued but historic affair. It signaled the official acceptance of Camilla into the heart of the establishment. The Parker Bowles family was there in force. Tom and Laura, Camilla's children, were front and center, looking respectable and proud. And Emma? Reports from the time are hazy, but the emotional reality is clear. Emma was the ghost at the feast. Whether she was there in person or watching from afar is almost irrelevant. Spiritually, she was miles away. She was the debris that had been swept under the rug so the wedding could take place. While her family was sipping champagne at Windsor Castle, celebrating their victory, Emma was likely in a darkened room in Los Angeles, nursing a hangover or a come-down, watching the coverage on CNN. Seeing her aunt in that hat, standing next to the future king, must have felt like a hallucination. The woman who had been the source of all her childhood shame was now Her Royal Highness. What did that make Emma? If the sinner is redeemed, what happens to the scapegoat? The cognitive dissonance pushed her over the edge. Her behavior in LA became increasingly erratic. There were car accidents, minor scrapes that hinted at a loss of control. There were relationships with unsuitable men, the kind of sharks who swim in the shallow waters of Hollywood, looking for vulnerable women with famous names. She was running out of money. The Parker Bowles novelty was wearing off. Hollywood is ruthless. It loves a fresh face, but it has no patience for a mess. The auditions stopped. The modeling gigs dried up. She was no longer the hot niece. She was just another addict in a town full of them. The physical toll was becoming impossible to hide. The bloated look of the alcoholic took hold. Her skin, once porcelain, was gray. She was dying in plain sight. She later described this period as a suicide of the soul. She wasn't actively trying to kill herself with a gun or a rope. She was trying to erase herself by degrees. She wanted to stop feeling. She wanted to stop being Emma Parker Bowles. There is a terrifying story that encapsulates the rock bottom of this era. Emma woke up one morning, or perhaps it was afternoon, time had lost its meaning, in a hospital bed. She didn't know how she had gotten there. The doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. Her body was shutting down. The liver, the kidneys, the heart, they were all waving white flags. She was alone, thousands of miles from the green fields of Gloucestershire. She had no husband, she had no children, she had no career. She had a famous name that she had dragged through the mud, and a contact list full of people who wouldn't pick up the phone. In that sterile hospital room, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, the glamour of her rebellion finally evaporated. For years, she had told herself that her drinking was a reaction to her trauma. I drink because of the press. I drink because of Diana. I drink because of Harry. It was a narrative of victimhood. But looking at the IV drip in her arm, she realized the terrifying truth. The press wasn't killing her. Charles wasn't killing her. Camilla wasn't killing her. She was killing herself. The Parker Bowles curse wasn't a mystical force. It was a cycle of addiction and repression that she had inherited and perfected, and she was the only one who could break it. This moment of clarity was not a cinematic epiphany with swelling music. It was a cold, hard slap of reality. She was faced with a binary choice. Die in Los Angeles as a tragic footnote, the wild child who burned out, or try to crawl back to the land of the living. She chose to crawl, but the road back would not be paved with gold. It would require her to do the one thing an aristocrat is never supposed to do: admit weakness. She had to ask for help. She had to dismantle the ego that had protected her for 30 years. She picked up the phone. She called home. The conversation that followed likely saved her life. It wasn't a conversation with the royal family. It wasn't a conversation with the press. It was a conversation with her parents, Richard and Camilla. Despite their own struggles, despite the dysfunction, the primal bond of family held. They didn't care about the scandal. They didn't care about the embarrassment. They just wanted their daughter back. Emma checked into rehab. Not the luxury spa rehabs where celebrities go to network, but a place where she had to do the work. She had to strip away the Parker Bowles armor and just be Emma. She had to confront the trauma of the 90s without the shield of vodka. As she began the grueling process of detoxification, the world outside continued to turn. The paparazzi moved on to new targets: Britney Spears, Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan. The heat on the Parker Bowles family cooled as Camilla settled into her role as Duchess. Emma was forgotten, and for the first time in her life, being forgotten was exactly what she needed. The silence of her anonymity became the soil in which she could finally, slowly, begin to grow something real. The flight from Los Angeles back to London is a journey into the past. For 10 hours, you sit in a pressurized tube suspended between the life you destroyed and the life you ran away from. When Emma Parker Bowles stepped off the plane at Heathrow, she wasn't greeted by paparazzi flashes or a chauffeur-driven car. She stepped into a gray, rainy English morning, stripped of her armor. The woman who returned was a ghost of her former self, facing a terrifying question. Who is Emma Parker Bowles if she isn't the life of the party? The final chapter of her story would not be played out in the nightclubs or the tabloids, but in the quiet, unglamorous rooms of recovery, where she would have to fight the hardest battle of all, the battle to forgive herself. Recovery is not a montage. In movies, the addict goes to rehab, cries in a group session, hugs a horse, and walks out cured with a healthy glow. The reality, as Emma Parker Bowles discovered upon her return to the UK, is a grinding, non-linear trench war. She checked into a treatment center far removed from the glamour of the Priory where celebrities go to network. This was the real deal. For the first time in her life, Emma had to sit in a room without a drink in her hand and introduce herself not as the niece and Urshin or the model or the girl Prince Harry dated, but simply as Emma, an alcoholic and an addict. It was a humiliation, but it was also a liberation. In the anonymity of the rooms of Anonymous, her last name didn't matter. Addiction is the great leveler. It doesn't care if your aunt is the Duchess of Cornwall or if you live in a council flat. It wants you dead just the same. The early years of her sobriety were fragile. She had to dismantle her entire social structure. She couldn't go back to the nightclubs of Mayfair. She couldn't hang out with the Sloane Rangers, who were still racking up lines in the bathrooms. She had to cut away the dead wood of her life, which meant losing 90% of her friends. She retreated to the countryside. The same green fields of Gloucestershire that had once felt suffocating now felt like a sanctuary. She reconnected with nature. She found solace in animals. This is a crucial pivot in her story. The girl who once posed in bikinis for Maxim began working with dog rescue charities. She was photographed not holding a champagne flute, but holding a leash, wearing muddy wellies and no makeup. In the eyes of the superficial press, this was a come down. In reality, it was an ascent. While Emma was rebuilding her soul brick by brick, the world around her was shifting on its axis. The long game played by Prince Charles was finally paying off. In the 2010s, the public rehabilitation of Camilla was complete. The Queen issued a decree that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles took the throne. The Rottweiler had become the matriarch. The press, which had once thrown bread rolls at her, now wrote glowing editorials about her charity work and her stabilizing influence on the king. Emma watched this from the sidelines. It must have been a surreal, out-of-body experience. The woman whose illicit love affair had defined Emma's entire traumatic childhood was now the second most important person in the country. The sin had been sanctified by the crown. But what about the collateral damage? What about the niece who had absorbed the hatred so the aunt could eventually be queen? There was no public apology. There was no thank you note from the palace. But Emma didn't seem to need one anymore. She had found a peace that rank and titles couldn't buy. In a rare moment of public vulnerability, she appeared on a reality TV show called The Jump. It was a minor blip in the cultural radar, but for Emma it was significant. She spoke openly about her addiction. She didn't glamorize it. She didn't blame her family. She took ownership. She showed the public that the wild child was actually a thoughtful, damaged, and recovering woman. And then history began to rhyme. As Emma found her footing, another Windsor War broke out. This time, it wasn't Charles and Diana. It was William and Harry. Emma must have watched the disintegration of Prince Harry with a profound sense of déjà vu. She saw the boy she had once comforted, the boy she had scandalously dated, turn into an angry, exiled man. She saw him fighting the press. She saw him medicating his pain. She saw him fleeing to California just as she had done 20 years prior. But there was a key difference. Harry chose noise. He wrote the book Spare. He did the Netflix documentary. He declared war on his family. Emma chose silence. She understood something that Harry perhaps has not yet learned. You cannot win a war against the monarchy by shouting. The institution is too old, too heavy, and too cold. It will simply wait you out. The only way to win is to leave the battlefield entirely. Emma left the battlefield. She didn't sell her story. She didn't write a memoir titled My Life with the Windsors. She didn't go on Oprah. She protected the privacy of the very people who had failed to protect her. Today, Emma Parker Bowles lives a life that is aggressively normal. She is not a princess. She is not a duchess. She is a woman in her 50s who walks her dogs, supports her charities, and stays sober one day at a time. When King Charles III was crowned in 2023, and Queen Camilla took her place beside him. The Parker Bowles family was there in the Abbey. Her cousins Tom and Laura were in the front row. Emma was there too in the background, unnoticed by the cameras that were obsessing over Harry's facial expressions. And that is her victory. She was the test subject for the royal scandal machine. She was the prototype for the modern royal outcast. She absorbed the toxicity of the 90s, processed it through her own suffering, and came out the other side not bitter, but whole. The tragedy of Emma Parker Bowles is that she was born into a play she didn't audition for. She was cast as the bad girl to make Diana look saintlier and to make Camilla's eventual redemption look more miraculous. She was the shadow that proved the light existed. But the triumph of Emma Parker Bowles is that she walked off the stage. She refused to play the role until it killed her. In the end, the story of the Windsor girl caught between Diana and Camilla isn't about royalty at all. It is a story about the devastating cost of family secrets. It is a reminder that while kings and queens worry about their legacy in the history books, the real battles are fought in the hearts of the children they leave behind. Emma survived the war, she survived the peace, and in a family defined by duty, title, and public image, she achieved the one thing that eluded Diana and still eludes Harry. She found a way to be free. She is the girl who fell off the edge of the world and climbed back up, not to reclaim her crown, but to reclaim her name. And in the quiet dignity of her survival, she proved that you don't need a title to be noble.